After my husband, Mark, and my best friend Chloe betrayed me, I lost everything. My job, my home, my entire life. They left me penniless in a cheap motel room, thinking I was finished and that they had gotten away with it all. But they didn't know about the secret my dead Aunt Clara left for me under the sagging bed. It started with a dusty suitcase containing $80,000. But that was just the travel money. The real fortune was $15 million, and the evidence to prove they weren't just liars. They were part of a conspiracy to cover up my mother's murder. I'm Elena Hayes, and before everything collapsed, my life looked so normal that I never thought to question it. I had a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood where people still knew each other's names. Mrs. Tanaka down the hall always smiled when she saw me. The apartment wasn't fancy. The walls were thin enough that I could hear our neighbors watching television, and the carpet had stains from tenants that predated us. But Mark and I had painted the living room a warm sunrise yellow together. We had a small shared balcony where we perpetually tried, and failed, to grow herbs. We'd spent an entire Saturday assembling furniture from flat-pack boxes, hanging our wedding photos on the wall where the afternoon light made everything look warmer than it was. I worked as a project coordinator at Pearson Partners, a mid-sized firm downtown. It wasn't the career I dreamed of, but it paid $52,000 a year plus benefits. It was enough to cover my half of the rent and groceries. I'd just successfully managed a complex website redesign for a local dental chain, and I finally felt like I was building real momentum in my career. My boss, David Pierce, was professional but distant, the kind of supervisor who complimented your reliability in meetings but never quite promoted you. Mark worked as a strategy analyst, or at least that's what he told me. His schedule was irregular late nights finishing proposals, weekend trips to meet founders in Chicago or Miami. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, and fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket, feeling that strange mixture of affection and loneliness. Proud he worked so hard while resenting how little time we actually spent together. We'd met 7 years ago. He'd been charming that night, asking questions about my work and actually listening to the answers. He had this intense way of focusing on you, making you feel like the only person in the room. It was intoxicating. Our courtship felt natural, easy. He proposed after 18 months in the park where we'd had our third date. I said yes without hesitation. But things had changed over the past 2 years. Subtle shifts I convinced myself were normal. Mark became protective of his phone, tilting the screen away when I walked past. He became vague about his work projects. He picked fights over small things, the way I loaded the dishwasher, how much time I spent talking to Chloe. Chloe had been my best friend since college. She was my maid of honor, crying during the ceremony in a way that made me cry too. In fact, she'd been the one to introduce me to Mark, which made our little trio feel even more faded. Every Thursday night for 5 years, she came over with wine, and we'd talk about everything. My frustrations at work, her dating disasters, my concerns that Mark and I were drifting apart. She listened with such genuine sympathy, often saying, "Elena, you're overthinking. Men like Mark need space to conquer the world. Don't crowd him." I believed her. If you can't trust your best friend, who can you trust? My mother, Laura, had died 6 years earlier in a car accident on a rainy night. My Aunt Clara, my mother's older sister, insisted something was wrong with the official story, but everyone dismissed her concerns as grief. Clara had always been the difficult one, the family member who showed up to gatherings with pamphlets about corporate corruption. We all wrote her off as paranoid. That Tuesday, 6 months ago, I woke up feeling sick to my stomach. Not a flu, but a deep, physical wrongness. I went to work at Pearson Partners, but I couldn't focus on the dental chain's social media calendar. The nausea got worse. I finally walked into David Pierce's office and told him I needed to go home. I expected resistance, but he just nodded easily. "Feel better," he said, in a tone that felt almost like relief. The drive home was quiet. The dread kept growing. When I pulled into our parking lot, I saw Chloe's silver Honda Civic in a visitor spot. It shouldn't have been strange, she had a key, but it felt wrong. She had canceled our upcoming Thursday wine night, claiming a family emergency in another state. I sat in my car for a full minute, trying to talk myself out of the feeling in my gut. I finally went up, putting my key in the lock as quietly as possible. The apartment wasn't empty. It had that occupied quiet. I could smell coffee, a fresh pot, which was strange since I hadn't made any that morning. Then I heard it. Laughter coming from our bedroom. Chloe's laughter. It was different. More intimate. The kind of laugh meant for someone specific. I stood frozen, my brain desperately trying to find an innocent explanation. But I knew. I crossed the living room and pushed the door open. Mark and Chloe were in my bed, tangled in the gray sheets I'd just washed. This was familiar territory for them. Comfortable routine. When Chloe saw me, the first emotion on her face wasn't shame, it was annoyance. Mark got out of bed, pulling on his jeans with practiced efficiency. "Elena," he said, in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. He was trying to gaslight me while standing half naked next to my best friend. Chloe sat up, holding the sheet around herself with insulting modesty. She had the nerve to look at me with pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said. "But honestly, Elena, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption stole my breath. Not just that she was sleeping with my husband, but that I should have known. "How long?" My voice sounded strange, detached. Mark answered. "Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." Pretending. That word cut through me. How long had every "I love you" been a lie? How long had Chloe sat on my couch, drinking my wine, listening to me worry about the very man she was sleeping with? I didn't scream. I turned, walked into the living room, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag. My laptop, chargers, toiletries, the practical things. Mark followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have his adult conversation. I walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for, drove to a parking lot 3 miles away, and cried until I couldn't breathe. Then I called my cousin Sophie and asked if I could sleep on her couch. That was 6 months ago. Sitting in that motel room, I understood that Tuesday had been even worse than I'd thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal, it had been calculated, planned, and part of something far bigger. I'd been living on my cousin Sophie's couch for 5 days when I got the call from David Pierce. Sophie had been kind, letting me stay in her guest room, and I'd been trying to maintain normalcy by going to work every day, pretending my life wasn't collapsing. David's voice on the phone had that careful, HR-approved tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. I showed up at 8:15 Monday morning, wearing clothes I'd ironed using Sophie's board. David waved me into his office. "Elena," he said, shuffling papers. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints." My stomach dropped. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated." He slid a folder toward me. I just stared at him. "Budget constraints?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "We just signed 3 new clients last month." David's expression didn't change. "These decisions are above my control," he said. "And we're shifting the dental chain account you secured to a senior analyst. Effective immediately. The decision is final." I didn't argue. I packed up my desk in 20 minutes. My coworkers suddenly became fascinated by their computer screens, or found urgent reasons to be in meetings. By 9 a.m., I was walking out with 4 years of my life in a cardboard box. Much later, I discovered that David Pierce and Mark hadn't just been acquaintances, they were college roommates. Fraternity brothers. My job had never been secure. It was just another piece on their board, conditional on my remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand. The divorce proceedings started 2 weeks after I lost my job. Mark hired Victoria Vance, an attorney with a reputation for strategic cruelty. My court-appointed attorney, Arthur Klein, seemed perpetually tired and smelled like stale coffee. He kept sighing and telling me the system was tough. He even missed a critical filing deadline for our joint assets, allowing Mark to drain our savings account while my side was frozen. The judge presiding was Miles Donovan, a man who seemed to have already made his decisions before we even spoke. Every motion Victoria Vance filed, Judge Donovan approved. Every request Arthur made, he denied. I lost the apartment because Mark's name was listed first on the mortgage. Even though I'd paid half of everything, I lost the car because I'd missed 2 payments during the chaos. I lost my retirement funds. The settlement left me with my clothing, my laptop, and nothing else. The worst part wasn't the material possessions. It was watching Chloe take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a navy blue designer suit, the exact one I'd convinced her to buy 2 years earlier, telling her it made her look confident. Now she was wearing it to destroy me. She sat there, hands folded, and lied with the kind of conviction that comes from practice. She told Judge Donovan, I'd been unstable and paranoid for months. She even fabricated a quote, her voice breaking with false concern. She told me, if Mark ever leaves me, I have nothing left to live for. I was so worried about her. It was a perfect, calculated performance. Judge Donovan nodded sympathetically. When Arthur Klein tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Mark, Victoria Vance objected, and the judge sustained it immediately. I sat there and finally understood. This was coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce, it was a planned demolition. After the divorce finalized, Sophie let me stay for 3 more weeks before her husband started making pointed comments. I'd hear them arguing through the thin walls. She can't stay here indefinitely, he'd say. You're not helping her by letting her hide. I started couch surfing before Sophie had to ask me to leave. A former colleague offered her couch for 10 days, then decided my negative energy was bad for her mental health. A friend from college let me stay for a week, then suddenly remembered. Her parents were visiting from out of the country for a month and needed the spare room. Everyone was sympathetic, right up until sympathy became inconvenient. When I finally scraped together $200 from sporadic freelance work, I paid for a weekly rate at the Summit Motel off Interstate 70. It felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift. The woman at the front desk, Linda, had an expression that suggested she'd seen this scenario thousands of times. She didn't ask questions. She just took my cash and handed me a key to room 2B. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered under industrial cleaner. The bed sagged in the middle, having given up on supporting anything. Through the thin walls, I could hear the constant low roar of trucks on the interstate, a sound that never stopped, day or night. This was home now. I tried to establish a routine. Mornings were for applying to jobs that never called back. Dinner was instant ramen prepared in the microwave. I avoided the mirror, because I didn't recognize the hollowed-out woman staring back. This was my life. A motel room smelling of failure, and the crushing understanding that nobody was coming to save me, because everyone who might have cared had already decided I was too much trouble. I'd been living in room 2B for 3 weeks, when I noticed the suitcase. My existence at the Summit Motel had devolved into a bleak, colorless routine. Mornings were for the sterile glow of my laptop screen, sending applications into a digital void that never replied. Afternoons were for whatever freelance projects I could find, small businesses that paid pennies for social media posts, and always paid late. Dinner was instant ramen, sometimes a can of soup from the convenience store 2 blocks away, eaten on the edge of the sagging bed. The television stayed on, not for entertainment, but just to have noise that wasn't the sound of my own thoughts, or the relentless roar of Interstate 70 outside my window. My neighbors were invisible ghosts. There was a long-haul trucker who nodded at me sometimes but never spoke. A woman who worked night shifts, her curtains permanently drawn. A man in the room next to mine played old country music just loud enough that I could hear the bass line through the thin walls. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back had my face, but her eyes were hollow, defeated. This was my life now. I only found it because I dropped my phone charger and it rolled under the bed frame. I got down on my hands and knees, reaching into the dusty space between the bed and the floor, my hand brushing against cobwebs and something else. Something solid. I pulled it out. It was an old suitcase. Battered brown leather with brass corners oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era. A luggage tag was attached to the handle with twine. When I turned it over, my hands started shaking. Elena Marie Hayes. My full name. written in the precise, careful script of my Aunt Clara. I sat on the floor, my heart pounding. Clara had died 9 months ago. I'd attended her funeral, stood at her graveside. She'd lived alone for decades. Died alone in her house in Boulder, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed in a motel I'd only been in for 3 weeks? Had she somehow known I'd end up here? Had she left it with Linda at the front desk, with instructions to put it in whatever room I ended up renting? The logistics seemed impossible, but the evidence was in my hands. The suitcase was locked. I turned it over and found a small plastic bag taped to the bottom. Inside, a single, small key. Clara had always been paranoid, but she'd also been practical. I unlocked the suitcase. Inside was money. $80,000 in cash, bundled with rubber bands, mostly $100 bills. They smelled faintly of mothballs and old books. Underneath the money was a plane ticket, printed on paper that was starting to yellow. One way to Denver, Colorado. The departure date was 4 days from now, and underneath the ticket was a note, handwritten on yellow legal paper. Elena, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Mark, don't trust Chloe. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is important. Use it wisely. I read the words 3 times. Finish what your mother started. My mother Laura had died 6 years ago in that car accident. Late night, rainy road. Clara had insisted something was wrong. She'd pulled me aside at the funeral, her eyes frantic, whispering that Laura had been investigating financial fraud at Novatech Biogen, the pharmaceutical company where she was an internal auditor. She said her death was too convenient. I dismissed it as grief twisting into paranoia. We'd all learned to nod politely at Clara's theories and change the subject. Now, sitting on the floor of a motel room, holding $80,000 and a note that said my aunt had been right about everything, I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. I spent that night staring at the money and the note, unable to sleep, the roar of the interstate outside fading into the background. Clara was offering me a choice: take the money and disappear, or use it to fight back. By morning, I had decided. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing while the people who destroyed my life moved on without consequence. I packed my duffel bag with the few possessions that mattered: some clothes, my laptop, and the $80,000, which I bundled into a waterproof bag I'd bought at the convenience store. I left a note for Linda at the front desk saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be returning. She glanced at me, then at the note, and gave a single, non-committal nod. "Good luck," she said, which could have meant anything. The flight to Denver left early on a Thursday morning. I'd spent the entire drive to the airport trying not to think about what I was doing. Flying across the country on instructions from a dead aunt, chasing a conspiracy theory that connected my husband's affair to my mother's death. It sounded insane, but the note was in my bag, and the money was real. Crazy or not, I was going. The airline was one of those budget carriers that charged extra for everything. I paid $15 to bring a duffel bag that weighed almost nothing, then spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman who monopolized both armrests and a college kid watching videos on his phone without headphones. I didn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop cycling through questions. What had my mother discovered that made her dangerous enough to kill? How deep did Mark and Chloe's involvement go? Had any part of the last 7 years been real? Denver greeted me with gray skies and a cold, heavy rain that seeped through my jacket. I rented a car using some of Clara's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding. The address on the note led me out of the city toward Boulder, a suburb that felt quiet in a way that suggested money and privacy. The GPS guided me through streets lined with mature trees and houses set back from the road. Clara's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small 1,970 seconds ranch-style place that hadn't been updated since. The lawn was wild, the driveway cracked with weeds. It was the kind of property that screamed, "Someone died here, and nobody knows what to do with it." I parked and sat in the rental car, engine running. What if the truth was worse than the lies? I turned off the engine before I could talk myself out of it. The front door was locked, but Clara had left a second key in the suitcase, taped inside an envelope marked, "House." I let myself in, stepping into air that smelled stale and undisturbed. The interior was exactly what I'd expected. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves, piled on tables. Filing cabinets stood in the living room where a couch should have been, all meticulously labeled. The kitchen looked barely used, but the note had directed me to the shed behind the house. I walked through to the back door and into an overgrown yard. The shed sat in the far corner, a simple structure, but the locks on the door were new. They were industrial grade, the kind you use when you're protecting something that matters. I used the third key Clara had left. This one marked shed. The lock opened smoothly. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic. Filing cabinets lined one wall, indexed with professional precision. In the back corner, partially hidden under a tarp, was a trapdoor set into the floor. I moved the tarp and found a handle and another lock. The fourth key worked. I opened it to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed down. It was a crawl space, converted into a climate-controlled evidence room. Battery-powered LED strips flickered on as I reached the bottom. The air was cool and dry, maintained by a dehumidifier humming in the corner. More filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with a laptop and an old cassette player. I started with the photographs arranged on the table. The first one I picked up made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped it. It was my mother, Laura, standing between Mark and Chloe at some kind of conference. All three of them were wearing name tags and smiling at the camera like colleagues. The banner in the background said, Novatech Biogen Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom of the photo was 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before Chloe had supposedly introduced me to Mark at a dinner party. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a chance meeting. I'd been a target before I'd been a girlfriend, a mark before I'd been a wife. I set the photograph down on the table, my hands trembling so violently I had to clench them into fists. My entire relationship with Mark, my decade-long friendship with Chloe, it was all performance art. I'd been a pawn in a game I didn't even know was being played. I looked at the old cassette player. Next to it sat a stack of tapes, each labeled in Aunt Clara's precise, careful script, with dates, names, and brief descriptions. My eyes landed on the first tape in the stack. The label read, Mark Hayes and Victor Harrison, March 2019. Discussion of Laura Hayes' investigation status. My mother's name made my chest tighten. I loaded the tape into the player and pressed the worn play button. There was a click, a hiss of static, and then voices. The first voice belonged to Mark. I'd heard that voice every day for 7 years. I'd heard it tell me he loved me. I'd heard it whisper promises about our future. Now, I was hearing it discuss my mother like she was a business problem. Laura's getting too close, Mark said, his tone chillingly businesslike, completely devoid of the warmth I knew. She's made copies of the trial data. We think she's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Elena. A second voice responded, older and more authoritative. That must be Victor Harrison. I whispered to the empty room. We can't let this go public, Mark. The approvals we've secured are worth billions. If she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Mark said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. But Laura doesn't discuss work details with Elena. She's protective, thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her. It's actually making my job harder because Elena doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Victor said, and the casual, cold indifference in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one internal auditor developed a conscience. I slammed the pause button, gagging, a sour taste rising in my throat. They were discussing killing my mother, planning it, and Mark, the man I'd married, the man I'd cried with at my mother's funeral, had been part of that conversation. He'd been using me, trying to gather information, and when that didn't work, I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Victor continued. We have people who specialize in this. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Mark asked. If Laura dies, Elena's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access. But there's also that aunt, Clara. She's paranoid and suspicious. She's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Victor said dismissively. Nobody takes Clara Hayes seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Laura's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics and contingencies, discussing my mother's murder with the same tone people use to plan a work project. When it ended, I sat in the silence of Clara's underground archive, the hum of the dehumidifier the only sound. Mark hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been a plant from the beginning, positioned in my life to monitor my mother. He'd courted me, married me, all as part of a strategy to protect a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. I found more tapes. Conversations between Chloe and someone named Dr. Evelyn Reed, apparently Chloe's aunt, and a senior researcher at Novatech. These recordings revealed Chloe's role. She'd been assigned to befriend me after my mother's death, to monitor me, to make sure I remained isolated and manageable. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance, every heart-to-heart had been data collection. Our entire friendship was a lie, fabricated to keep me under control. I don't know how long I sat in that crawl space, listening to tapes and reading documents. Hours passed. My back ached, and my eyes burned from the LED light. I pieced together the full scope of what they'd done to my mother, and to me. Finally, I found the laptop Clara had left. It was plugged into a power strip, its battery fully charged. A sticky note on the screen said, "Play this first," with an arrow pointing to a video file labeled "For Elena." I opened the file. Aunt Clara's face filled the screen. She looked exactly as I remembered, though visibly ill. Her face was drawn, her hands shook slightly, but her eyes were sharp. "Elena," she began, her voice steady. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead, and you found my archive, which means you're probably angry and confused, and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused, taking a sip of water. "The answer is, I tried. I warned you about Mark at your engagement party. I told you something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Chloe behaved around him. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your life." Her expression softened. "I don't blame you. I'd spent decades being the eccentric aunt. By the time I tried to warn you about Mark, you'd already learned to dismiss me. Your mother, Laura, was my best friend. When she discovered what Novatech was doing, falsifying trial data for a new heart medication, burying reports of fatal side effects, she came to me. She knew I would help her document it properly. We spent months building a case. Then she died in that convenient accident." Clara coughed, a deep, rattling sound. When she pulled her handkerchief away, I could see blood on it. "I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording. I did it because I loved your mother, and because I love you. I couldn't let them get away with killing Laura and destroying your life." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You have 2 choices, Elena. The same 2 choices your mother had. You can take the money I left you and disappear. Change your name, move somewhere far away, and live comfortably. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival. You've already lost so much." She coughed again, harder this time. "Or, you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and burn these people to the ground. Expose Novatech. Expose Mark and Chloe and everyone who participated. It won't be easy. They have money and lawyers. You'll be in danger. But if you fight, you might actually win." A small, crooked smile touched her lips. "Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. I love you, Elena. Don't let them win." She reached for something off camera. "Oh, and one more thing. Rocky Mountain Trust? Account number 8,821. The password is your mother's employee number from Novatech. That's the real fortune. The $80,000 in the suitcase, that really is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight, or use it to run. But for God's sake, use it." The video ended. I sat staring at the blank screen, my heart hammering. I pulled out my phone and searched for Rocky Mountain Trust. It took 45 minutes of navigating automated menus before I reached a human. I gave them the account number. The representative went quiet. "Ma'am," she said, her voice suddenly much more professional. "I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold." A woman named Patricia came on the line and asked me to verify my identity, using my mother's employee number. When I gave it to her, she paused. "Mrs. Hayes, your aunt established a trust in your name. It contains stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights your mother secured before her death. The total value is approximately $15 million. $15 million? Clara hadn't just left me evidence, she'd left me an arsenal. She had built a financial foundation so I could fight without being crushed by legal fees. I looked around the small, cold room, at the stacks of files that represented my aunt's entire life. My choice was made. I chose to fight. I found the contact information Clara had left in a file labeled Allie's. I dialed the number for Agent Lena Petrova at the FBI's Denver field office. I held the phone for a long moment. The contact Lena Petrova, FBI glowing on the screen. I dialed. It rang 3 times, and a brisk professional voice answered. "Petrova, my name is Elena Hayes," I said, my own voice shaking. "My aunt was Clara Hayes. She left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build, about Novatech Biogen and my mother Laura Hayes." The line went completely silent. I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then, Petrova's voice returned. All briskness gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "Where are you right now, Mrs. Hayes?" "I'm at my aunt's property in Boulder." "Don't leave," she commanded. "Don't talk to anyone else. Don't touch anything else in that archive. Whatever Clara left you, just wait. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She arrived in 35, driving faster than was probably legal. Agent Lena Petrova was in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical, severe bun. She wore jeans and a blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me standing in Clara's overgrown backyard with an expression that was part skepticism and part desperate hope. "Show me," she said. I led her to the shed, unlocked the industrial-grade locks, and pointed down the ladder into the darkness. She didn't hesitate. I followed her down into the climate-controlled archive. I watched her face as she took it all in, the filing cabinets, the boxes, the meticulous organization. She put on latex gloves, her movements precise. She pulled out a file, then a cassette tape, reading the labels. Her professional mask cracked for just a second, revealing sheer astonishment. She finally turned to me after 20 minutes of silent review. "Your aunt. She was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered, or she was completely brilliant. Probably both." She held up the tape I had listened to, the one with Mark and Victor Harrison. "This," she said, "this is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, possibly murder. Elena, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical corporation." The investigation that followed moved with a bureaucratic slowness that Petrova assured me was normal. Subpoenas had to be drafted, warrants approved, bank records needed freezing, former Novatech employees were interviewed, and Clara's files gave the FBI a precise roadmap of who to talk to. Petrova helped me find a small, secure apartment in Denver, a 1-bedroom in an old building with hardwood floors. I used the money from Clara's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, but I kept it modest. The $15 million wasn't for me. It was a war chest. I lived simply, waiting, while the investigation churned forward. The waiting was harder than anything. I met with prosecutors every few weeks. They had detailed questions about Mark's schedule, Chloe's visits, my mother's behavior. I answered everything, watching them take notes, building something substantial. Then, 6 months after I first called Petrova, things started happening. It began on a Wednesday. Novatech Biogen's gleaming headquarters were raided by federal agents. The images made national news. Employees stood in the parking lot while agents in FBI windbreakers carried out boxes of documents. Victor Harrison, the COO whose voice I'd heard discussing my mother's murder, was arrested at his mansion. News cameras caught him being led out in handcuffs, looking indignant and surprised. Petrova called me that afternoon. "We got him," she said, a quiet satisfaction in her voice. "And we just picked up Mark Hayes at his new office. He'd been working at a tech startup." I watched the local news that evening, rewinding the footage. Mark, walking with his head up, still trying to look arrogant, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He genuinely thought he was untouchable. Chloe was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Seattle, where she'd moved. The news footage showed her crying as they put her in the car. The tears felt performative, just like the ones she'd shed at my trial. Then came the final piece. Judge Miles Donovan. He abruptly resigned from the bench, citing a desire to spend more time with family. Petrova called me. "He's been indicted." Clara's files showed he'd purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced back to a Novatech subsidiary. He's been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years. A week later, I got another call. "Your divorce case was among the first reviewed," Petrova said. A new judge took 15 minutes. "The original ruling has been vacated. Elena, your marriage to Mark is being annulled. The court is declaring it invalid from the beginning. Due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system." The apology didn't undo the months I'd spent at the Summit Motel, but it was acknowledgement. It was a start. The trials began 6 months after the arrests. Petrova had warned me that cases this complex moved slowly, that building prosecutions against multiple defendants required patience. She was right. The legal process ground forward with bureaucratic thoroughness. Victor Harrison went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers, many of whom Clara had identified years ago, testified about the culture of fraud at Novatech. They described how executives, led by Harrison, incentivized researchers to manipulate trial data for their flagship heart medication, the one my mother had been investigating. Patients who had been harmed by the drug shared their stories. A woman whose husband had died from complications spoke for 20 minutes about watching him suffer, all while Novatech buried the safety data. Forensic accountants explained the money trails that connected executive bonuses directly to the fraudulent approvals. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment, Victor Harrison showed no visible emotion. He stood while the judge read the sentence. 25 years in federal prison and forfeiture of $40 million in assets. I watched from the gallery. It wasn't closure. Not really. It was more like watching a long, complex mathematical equation finally balance. Mark's trial was smaller, quieter. But for me, it was more personal. I attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the back row. The prosecutors presented his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an extended intelligence operation. The recordings Clara had collected were played in court. I listened to Mark's voice, cold and detached, discussing my mother as an obstacle. I heard him strategize with Harrison about how to use my grief against me. The prosecutors presented bank records showing monthly payments made to him from a Novatech shell company, demonstrating that he had been compensated for every single month he'd spent pretending to love me. His defense attorney tried to argue he was a low-level participant, manipulated by powerful people. But the recordings showed an enthusiastic, willing partner who'd made strategic suggestions. The jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Mark finally looked at me across the courtroom. His expression was a complicated mix of anger and resignation, as if he still couldn't believe the woman he'd married as a job had been the one to bring the evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking, without emotion, until the bailiffs led him away. Chloe accepted a plea deal rather than going to trial. In exchange for testimony against her aunt, Dr. Evelyn Reed, and other Novatech employees, her sentence was reduced to 7 years. She provided information that helped prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped accountability. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter. 3 pages, written on prison stationery, full of apologies from Chloe. She wrote about how she'd been young and desperate for money when Novatech approached her, how being assigned to befriend me had started as just a job, but had become complicated because she'd actually grown to care about me. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other, because our friendship had meant something real to her, despite the lies. I read the letter once while sitting in my Denver apartment. I felt nothing but a hollow, cold satisfaction. The letter was self-justification, an attempt to rewrite history so she could see herself as a victim rather than a predator. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed the letter away in a folder with other evidence of betrayal and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroy your life, just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Novatech Biogen took another 2 years to resolve, long after the criminal trials had concluded. The company, even with its former COO Victor Harrison in federal prison, fought aggressively. They deployed teams of lawyers, the kind of polished, ruthless attorneys that charge thousands per hour, to challenge every claim, drag out proceedings, and bury us in procedural paperwork. Their strategy was obvious: to exhaust us emotionally and financially, hoping we would settle for pennies on the dollar just to make it stop. They didn't know about the $15 million war chest Clara had left me. They didn't realize that, for me, this was never about the money. It was about the truth. I hired my own team of sharks, attorneys who specialized in corporate malfeasance, funded entirely by the Rocky Mountain Trust. We matched them, motion for motion, deposition for deposition, and eventually, facing the mountain of evidence that had already secured criminal convictions, and the looming threat of more damaging public testimony from victims, they settled. The terms were staggering. Novatech Biogen was required to pay $3.1 billion into a fund for the patients and families who had been harmed by their fraudulent drugs, particularly the heart medication my mother had tried to stop. They were forced to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they had brought to market in the past decade, and they were placed under 15 years of strict federal monitoring, with regulators embedded in their approval processes to prevent future fraud. It was a victory for public health, bought with my mother's life and my aunt's obsession. My mother's estate, Laura Hayes' estate, received $10 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative. I sat in my quiet Denver apartment, the one Agent Petrova had helped me find, and looked at the settlement agreement. This money felt tainted. It was blood money, earned through my mother's murder, and validated by 6 years of my aunt's grief-fueled investigation. I already had enough resources from Clara's trust to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I knew immediately what I had to do. I donated every single dollar of the $10 million wrongful death settlement. I split it between organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency, and a new fund established to support industry whistleblowers. The money felt like a heavy weight, and giving it away was the only way I could breathe. Instead, I used a significant portion of Clara's original $15 million trust to start the Hayes Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose corporate misconduct. We hired our own investigators, many former FBI agents, including Elena Petrova, who retired from the bureau and joined our board of directors. We funded legal defenses for employees facing retaliation after reporting problems. We published reports that made pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable, shining a bright light into the dark corners where they preferred to operate in shadows. The foundation became my full-time work. It was my way of channeling the grief for my mother and the fierce, paranoid loyalty of my aunt into something productive. It was something that would have made them both proud, turning their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people, instead of just being tragic endings to lives cut short by greed. I still think about Room 2B at the Summit Motel sometimes. I think about sitting on that sagging bed, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, listening to the constant, relentless roar of the trucks on Interstate 70, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there, the one Linda at the front desk gave me, tucked away in my wallet. It's a reminder that rock bottom is real, that humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, your job, your home, your very identity, but they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Aunt Clara had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case, assembling an arsenal, because she believed truth mattered more than comfort, and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid aunt everyone dismissed had been the only one who understood how the world actually worked. She recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. The final truth Clara left me proved prophetic in ways I'm still discovering. Fighting doesn't always lead to winning, but not fighting guarantees losing. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. It's a messy, complicated, and fundamentally honest life. The kind of ending my mother, Laura, and my Aunt Clara would have appreciated. I'm not the woman I was when I found that suitcase under the motel bed. I'm stronger than she was, more careful about who I trust, but also more certain about what truly matters. That woman in room 2B didn't understand how much she could survive, or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful, every day, that I'm not her anymore.